Okay, so between 1400 and 1800, European mariners launched a remarkable series of exploratory voyages that took them to nearly all of Earth's waters. The voyages, however, were expensive. Okay, yet private investors and government authorities they had strong motives for this, and therefore they helped pay for it. They invested in it, and also they invested in the latest nautical technology. So the voyages of exploration, um, governments and private investors were happy to invest in this because they paid large dividends. Okay, so there was a huge payoff, as we know, with the African slave trade that emerged out of this. They enabled European mariners to chart the world's ocean basins and develop an accurate understanding of world geography. So, on the basis of that knowledge, the European merchants and the mariners they established these global networks of communication, transportation, and exchange, and they profited handsomely from this. And of course, this eventually would lead to European domination of the world and the emergence of very wealthy European countries like France and England, and eventually, once it unified, Germany. Here's a map that was put together in 1512 by a Polish cartographer, showing what he thought the Americas looked like. And this shows just how unaware they were about the extent of the American continent. So they've got all the east bit with Florida and some of the islands in the West Indies there, and they've got South America, but they really had no idea about the extent of the Americas. And it was following this in the between 14 and 1800, from 1512 onwards, when this was put together, that they European explorers and cartographers really got an accurate maps of the world done. So what is going to be really important for the essay, Ben, is focusing on the motives, the reasons for exploration, for European exploration in this period. So the motives were a complex combination that prompted Europeans to explore the world's oceans. So there were a few factors, but the most important of these motives was the search for basic resources and lands that were suitable for the cultivation of cash crops, and the desire to establish trade routes in Asian markets and expand the influence of Christianity. So we have resources, land for cash crops, trade routes, Christianity. And remember, Christianity in Europe had fragmented at this point. Remember, it was the Catholic Church up until the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Reformation. So you get your different denominations of Christianity throughout Europe at this point. So a good example of showing the motives and reasons for exploration would be Portugal. Okay, so Portugal, as we know, is a country here besides Spain on the Iberian Peninsula. Now, mariners from the relatively poor Kingdom of Portugal, it was a kingdom at this point, were most prominent in the search for fresh resources and lands. Okay, so beginning in the 13th century, so the Portuguese seamen, they ventured away from the coasts and into the open Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean being, of course, the bridge between the Americas and Europe. And they went there to supplement their own meager resources because, yeah, Portugal had bugger all resources. They went to search for more. So by the early 14th century, they discovered the uninhabited Azores and Madeiras Islands, and they also called frequently at the Canary Islands, who were inhabited by the indigenous Guanche people. And this shows them here. So we got Portugal here, the Iberian Peninsula, with Portugal and Spain, and we have Madeira here, the Madeiras Islands, and we've got the Canary Islands here. So they called frequently into these islands, and these Atlantic islands were ideal for the cultivation of sugar, a product that had really strong demand in all of Europe, of course. So in the 15th century, Italian investors who had organized sugar plantations in the Mediterranean since the 12th century, they helped the Portuguese mariners establish plantations in the Atlantic islands. So continuing Portuguese voyages also led to the establishment of plantations in Cape Verde Islands, Sao Tome, Principe, and Fernando Po. And that's how they're spelled, Madeiras, Canary Islands. So even more alluring than the exploitation of fresh lands and resources was the goal of establishing maritime trade routes to the markets of Asia. So during the era of the Mongol empires, European merchants often traveled overland as far as China to trade for Asian goods. So when the Mongol empires collapsed and the bubonic plague spread across Europe and Asia in the 14th century, travel on the Silk Roads became really dangerous. So as a result, the Europeans relied on Muslim mariners to bring Asian goods through the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea to Cairo. So we've got the Red Sea here, and of course Cairo is the capital of Egypt. So Muslim mariners, they brought Asian goods through the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea to Cairo, where Italian merchants purchased them for distribution in Western Europe, up here. So as you can see, Italy isn't too far from Cairo and Egypt. But prices at Cairo were high, of course, because there was a lot of travel involved. And Europeans sought ever larger quantities of Asian goods, particularly spices from India. So by the 14th century, the wealthy classes of Europe regarded Indian pepper and Chinese ginger as expensive necessities, and cloves and nutmeg from as well. And merchants and monarchs, they realized that by gaining direct access to Asian markets and eliminating the Muslim intermediaries, they could increase the quantities of spices and other Asian goods that were available in Europe while maintaining the enormous profits. So trade intermediaries. African trade also encouraged Europeans to explore. Since the 12th century, Europeans had purchased a lot of West African gold, ivory, and of course slaves brought to North Africa ports by Muslim merchants. Again, Muslim merchants were an important intermediary involved in this. So West African gold was especially important to Europeans because it was their principal form of payment for Asian luxury goods. As in the case of Asian trade, the Europeans realized that they could profit from eliminating Muslim middlemen and of course establishing maritime routes that offered direct access to African markets. So common themes here: eliminating the trade intermediaries, the Muslim intermediaries, and having direct access was a good reason for European exploration. So alongside the material incentives, the goal of expanding the boundaries of Christendom or Christianity drove Europeans into the larger world. So, like Buddhism and Islam, Christianity is a missionary religion. And it directs believers to spread the faith. So sometimes these efforts were attempted through peaceful persuasion, and at other times the expansion of Christianity could be very violent, as we saw in the Crusades. So beginning in the 11th century, for example, Western Europeans launched a series of crusades against the Muslims in Palestine, the Mediterranean islands, and Iberia. As we talked about, these had large Muslim communities. In Iberia, remember, is just the peninsula of Portugal and Spain. It's called the Iberian Peninsula. In Iberia, the Muslim kingdom of Granada fell to Spanish Christian forces just weeks before Christopher Columbus set sail on his famous first voyage to the Western Hemisphere in 1492. So whether through persuasion or violence, overseas voyages, they offered fresh opportunities for Western Europeans to spread their faith. In practice, the various motives for exploration combined and reinforced one another. When the Portuguese mariner Vaso da Gama reached the Indian port of Calicut in 1498, local authorities asked him what he wanted there, and he simply replied, "Christians and spices," which I thought was quite funny. Remember, he likes quotes. The guy who marks these exams. So the goal of spreading Christianity thus became a powerful justification and reinforcement for the more material and economically minded motives for the voyages of exploration. Here we can see how effective the Christian missionaries and expeditions and colonial endeavors were in spreading European Christianity across the world. So we have most of South America being very Catholic, of course. North America, well, of course, very, very Christian. Sub-Saharan Africa, very Christian. And of course, Oceania down here. So, and of course, the Europeans were very effective in eliminating Islam from traditionally Islamic countries like on the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean. The technology of exploration wasn't so much a reason, but a thing that allowed it to happen. So without the advanced nautical technology and navigational skills, even the strongest motives would not have enabled European mariners to scale the world's oceans. They also needed the sturdy ships, good navigational equipment, knowledge of sailing techniques, and they devised these by combining Chinese and Arabic technologies with their own inherited nautical technologies from the Mediterranean and Northern Europe. So European sailors, they learnt to construct ships strong enough to brave most of the adverse conditions. And beginning in the 12th century, they increased the maneuverability of their craft by building a rudder onto the stern of ships. It was a Chinese invention, the rudder as well. And they outfitted their vessels with two types of sails. The square sails were the most common, of course, which enabled them to take full advantage of a wind blowing. So essentially the dream to come true, of travel to come true. So we'll just have a quick look at Christopher Columbus. So while Portuguese navigators piled the sea route into India, the Italian explorer Chris Columbus, he lived from he proposed sailing to the markets of Asia by a western route. So again, economic motivation. So on the basis of wide reading in the existing geographical literature of the time, Columbus believed that the Earth was relatively a small sphere, with a circumference much smaller than it actually was. So by his calculations, Japan should have been less than 2,500 nautical miles west of the Canary Islands, where in reality it's 10,000 nautical miles. So this geography suggested that sailing west from Europe to Asian markets would be profitable, and Columbus sought royal sponsorship for a voyage to prove his ideas. So economic incentives based on incorrect geographical info. So in August, his fleet of 3 ships departed from southern Spain. He sailed south to the Canaries, picked up supplies, and then turned west with the trade winds. And on the 12th of October 1492, he made landfall at an island in the Bahamas. And thinking he had arrived in the Spice Islands, known as the Indies, Columbus called the town people that he met there the Indians. He sailed around the Caribbean for almost 3 months in search of gold, and at the last island of Cuba, he sent a delegation to seek the court of the Emperor of China. And when Columbus returned to Spain, he reported to his royal sponsors that he had reached the islands just off the coast of Asia, when he had in reality reached the islands just off the coast of the Americas, the West Indies. So in summary, the global commercial and biological exchanges arose from the efforts of European mariners to explore the world's waters and establish sea lanes that would support long distance trade. So the search for sea routes to Asia led them to the Western Hemisphere and the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. They gained a lot of geographical knowledge, and that enabled them to link the world's regions into a finely articulated network of trade.